And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Chinese President Hu Jintao is in Washington for his first official state visit to the White House, who landed at Andrews Air Force Base Tuesday afternoon and had a rare private dinner with President Obama and the First Lady after lunch at the State Department on Wednesday. Hu arrived at the White House amid the pomp and ceremony of an official state visit, complete with military band and 21-gun salute. Outside the White House gates, a few dozen demonstrators gathered, calling for a free Tibet. The series of meetings with Hu at the White House included one attended by business executives from powerful corporations, including Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, General Electric, and Boeing. The New York Times said, quote, the White House has sought to turn Mr. Hu's visit into a kind of trade show for American companies.
Just before the summit, President Obama and Hu Jintao held a rare joint news conference and announced a $45 billion trade deal between their two countries. Many critics noted that Obama, as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was hosting a banquet for a leader who is imprisoning another Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the jailed Chinese human rights activist and writer Liu Xiaobo. Obama referenced human rights in his address and admitted that differences on human rights were a source of tension.
I have been very candid with President Hu about these issues. Occasionally, they are a source of tension between our two governments. But what I've believed is the same thing that I think 7 previous presidents have believed, which is that we can engage and discuss these issues in a frank and candid way, focus on those areas where we agree, while acknowledging there are going to be areas where we disagree.
Chinese President Hu Jintao acknowledged that a lot still needs to be done in China over human rights.
China is a developing country with a huge population and also a developing country in a crucial stage of reform. In this context, China still faces many challenges in economic and social development. And a lot still needs to be done in China in terms of human rights.
For more on the issue of human rights and China, we're joined by 2 guests. Sharon is the Executive Director of Human Rights in China, an international NGO based in Hong Kong and New York. She's joining us in New York. And joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, Marc Blecher, a professor of politics and East Asian studies at Oberlin College and the author of several books, including China Against the Tides. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Sharon, let's begin with you. The human rights situation in China and how important is it to be raised here while Hu Jintao is meeting with President Obama and other legislative leaders?
Well, as Secretary Clinton's inaugural Holbrooke lecture laid out a very comprehensive how important human rights is and that it is the fundamental pillar for trade and all the other aspects of the relationship. But unfortunately, as documented extensively by human rights organizations like my own, like independent bodies at the UN, the human rights situation in China is intensifyingly, it's deteriorating, and also across the board for civil society, for freedom of expression, for the lawyers, the crackdowns. It's quite a serious situation. I think the Chinese government's response to Liu Xiaobo receiving the prize really gives an insight to the depth of the problem, and that is China embarked on an intense threatening and intimidation campaign of the international community, including all the foreign missions in Oslo, not to attend, and really threatened the Norwegian government and really
not
couldn't
to attend the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony.
Well, threatened the Norwegian government in the lead-up that there should not be a Chinese decision. And I think the committee got very clear indications that it could not be a Chinese recipient this year. And the committee, I think, with great credit to their credibility, the principled stance they took, felt that you really needed to give a prize this year to a Chinese recipient, and particularly one who has peacefully advocated for democratic reforms in China and has been sentenced to 11 years for simply peaceful activities. So I think that the reactions during the lead-up to the Nobel Prize, the crackdowns, the house arrests, the detentions, the disappearances, asking people like activists, lawyers, the spokesperson for the Tiananmen Mothers, Ding Zelin, wrote about her 75 days of detention and house arrest and intimidation. And this is a elderly, person not in very good health, who, as your listeners might know, lost her son in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. So these all are an insight into the differences that have been referred to endlessly in this visit. And it is important that, yes, there are differences, but there is a fundamental difference that's really being papered over in the talks and in all of the. And that fundamental difference is, this is not simply a difference of political systems. This is not simply a difference of culture or language or histories. This is a difference in that the Chinese government is a one-party authoritarian system that absolutely has zero tolerance for critical, different voices. And I think Liu Xiaobo is a great symbol of that. And for the U.S. government to think that it's possible to have sustainable economic trade and exchanges with a government that is not accountable to its own people, that is not transparent, and that is rife with corruption, and does not have a functioning legal system, and that cracks down on judges and lawyers, and doesn't have an independent media, and doesn't have independent civil space. How is that going to be a constructive, cooperative system, relationship, that's good for the U.S. and that's good for China?
But isn't that, from the point of view of many of these corporations that were attending these private meetings, isn't that part of the way that they have been able to flourish in China? Precisely that they've been able to build their companies under an authoritarian system, and that it seems to me that many of these meetings between Chinese and American leaders, there's almost like a perfunctory discussion of human rights for the press and the media, while the real business goes on behind the scenes between the corporate leaders and the government leaders in China. And your sense to what degree President Obama in his remarks, and even President who said at one point, yes, China has a lot to do in this area, were basically playing to the media while they were at the same time dealing with the real business of the relationship, which is promoting more economic development.
I think your reference to it as playing to the media is really right on, that there was a lot of high-level discussions leading up to the summit meeting. So many of the agreements that were announced at the press conference had not been reached during the discussions. Of course, a lot of that, but this is about standard, I think, had been worked out way in advance. GE has been in China, I think, almost 100 years, perhaps one of the oldest. And some of these companies were actually instrumental during the lead-up to the Olympics in building the state-of-the-art biometric systems of monitoring and surveillance and the cameras and the digital. So they actually have benefited from being part of building the architecture of surveillance, I think, in China as well. And I think it's short-sighted. It's not very good business to think that you can continue to do business and make a profit off of the backs of Chinese workers and of a system that is essentially not accountable. And you can start seeing that there are businesses who have found that if they needed to go into a dispute resolution system, of which there are no independent system, that will be a real problem.
I wanted to get Professor Marc Blecher's response to the human rights situation and what Sharon Hum, head of human rights in China, has to say. Professor Blecher, thanks for joining us.
It's an honor to be on your program, Amy and Juan. Of course, the situation that Sharon describes of the Chinese state locking up political opponents is repugnant. The question is, what do you do about it? The story that Sharon has told us about how much tighter things got after the Nobel Prize was given to Liu Xiaobo actually shows us the problems of lecturing China on human rights or going further. In this case, by the Nobel Committee making such a pronounced political point out of the human rights situation in China. The issue then becomes, what do you do about it? what Sharon's story told us is that the more you raise it, the more you raise it in public, the more the Chinese state will react against it, the more they will actually harden things and make things worse for the very people we're trying to help. The best way to help political opponents in China is through quiet back channel sorts of operations. There is a very interesting outfit called the Duihua Foundation. I encourage the audience to Google them and look them up, run by a gentleman named John Cam, who actually have been successful in helping political opponents who've suffered mistreatment in China. But they work quietly behind the scenes in ways that allow the Chinese state to relax things in some individual cases, but not lose face about it. So I'm wary of lecturing the Chinese state or of actually bigger shows of Western opposition like the Nobel Prize, because I think they actually hurt the people who everyone is trying to help in this situation.